When a man vanishes from small-town Virginia without a trace, investigators face the most perplexing case of their careers. The enduring mystery of the whereabouts of a loving son and father is explored in this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening to Last Seen Alive. I'm your host, Leah, crime analyst by day and true crime storyteller by night.
And as always, I'm your co-host, Scott.
This case, like another one of our recent episodes, was suggested to us by someone many of you know, my brother Jake, the forensic investigator who's appeared on a couple of past episodes. Not only is he an excellent investigator, his interest in solving cases extends beyond the scope of his professional responsibilities, and he has a knack for finding cases that few people have heard about. Thanks for the case suggestion, Jake. This is definitely a case where someone knows something and that could use some public attention. Israel Smith was last seen alive on March 10th, 2008. He was 28 years old at the time and lived in Wytheville, Virginia. Wytheville is a small town of about 8,000 people located in the southwestern part of the state, not far from the West Virginia and Tennessee borders. Israel was originally from that part of the state, and for a while he lived in the town of Bristol, which toes the Virginia-Tennessee line and is about an hour's drive from Wytheville. However, he moved from Bristol to Wytheville approximately 2 years prior to his disappearance. Israel lived alone, but had a 7-year-old son named Isaiah who resided primarily in the next county over with his mom. Although Israel was no longer together with Isaiah's mom, he had a very close bond with Isaiah, who he looked forward to spending time with nearly every weekend. When not with his son or other family members who lived locally, Israel spent much of his time at his job. He worked at the local Radio Shack electronics store, which, conveniently, was only about a 5-minute drive from his apartment. According to his supervisors there, he was a solid employee, someone who could be depended upon. Israel enjoyed his job, but he had aspirations beyond it. According to what he wrote on his MySpace page not long before his disappearance, he planned to attend the local community college that fall and to study to become an electrician. Also, according to his MySpace page, he was into music. He enjoyed songwriting and had even previously been a sound engineer for a Christian rock band. He also dreamed of one day moving to Hawaii. Unfortunately, he never got the chance to fulfill those goals. Work ended up being one of the last places Israel was ever seen. On the evening of March 10th, a Monday, he clocked out and told his supervisor he'd see him the next day. That was at about 8 p.m. After that, rather than going straight home, Israel drove to his brother Daniel's house, also in Wytheville, and stopped in for a visit. Afterward, presumably, he went home. His brother and co-workers would later tell investigators that nothing had seemed off with Israel that day, that he'd been behaving normally. But when Israel failed to show up for his shift at Radio Shack the next day, that wasn't normal. Not only did he not report to work, he was a no-call, no-show, which was a first for him. He'd been working at that store for 6 months, and on the rare occasions he couldn't make it in, he always called to let a manager know. According to reporting by journalist Nate Hubbard, Israel's manager, Charles May, said that, quote, "I think he maybe missed 2 days the whole time he was here. It's just totally uncharacteristic of him to do something like this. It just totally befuddled all of us." End quote. Unsurprisingly, his employer began to worry, and so did his mom, Debbie Bates, also sometimes referred to as Debbie Sexton in some reporting on this case. She wasn't aware that he hadn't shown up to work, but she noticed when he didn't call. Normally, they spoke on the phone several times a week, sometimes even every day. She lived in the area, so on March 11th and 12th, she swung by his apartment on the corner of East Fulton Street. It was one of 4 small, individual apartments in the modest building, which was surrounded by single-family homes in a remarkably ordinary neighborhood. Debbie left sticky notes on Israel's door, asking him to call her. The 13th, Thursday, was Israel's brother Daniel's birthday. When Israel didn't make an appearance at Daniel's place or even call him to wish him a happy birthday, his family began to grow concerned. Daniel remarked to his and Israel's mom, Debbie, that he thought Israel's absence was strange, and she agreed. That evening, Debbie, Daniel, and Daniel's girlfriend drove to Israel's apartment. According to what Debbie would later tell journalist Jasmine Franks, when they arrived at Israel's apartment, Israel's vehicle, a green 1992 Ford Explorer, was parked outside as if he was home. However, when they knocked on the door, there was no answer. A neighbor told them that they hadn't seen Israel lately.
Yeah, the fact that they point out that his vehicle was there this time stands out because it wasn't mentioned when she first visited.
I believe that it was there when she had visited previously, or at least to the best of my knowledge it was. The fact is that there's not a great deal of reporting on this case, and the reporting that I was able to find didn't explicitly say. So I assume, because it didn't say otherwise, that the vehicle was there each time she checked, but I don't actually know. So take that with a handful of salt. Debbie returned the following day, the 14th, on her own to check on Israel. It was the 4th day in a row that she'd stopped by his apartment hoping to see him, and there was still no sign of him other than his parked vehicle. She was perplexed and increasingly uneasy about the situation. Yes, Israel was 28 years old enough to do what he wanted without checking in with family members on a daily basis, for sure. But several days of radio silence was out of character for him, especially considering that he hadn't even wished his brother a happy birthday. Debbie tried the doors to Israel's vehicle and found them unlocked. This, too, was unusual. Israel had always been a stickler for locking his vehicle no matter where he parked it. Debbie lived well outside of town in a rural part of the county, and when he visited her, which he often did, he always locked his car. It was a long-established habit of his, and she knew it. And yet, she was able to open the doors and survey the inside of his vehicle. There was a basket of clean laundry inside, and, well, that was it, at least as far as public knowledge goes. Debbie tried the door to his apartment next and found that it, too, was unlocked. Israel was nowhere inside. She checked. And after that, according to reporting on this case by journalist Jasmine Franks, Debbie called the police. Unbeknownst to Debbie at the time, she wasn't the first to contact local authorities regarding her son's apparent disappearance. For that matter, she wasn't even the first to check inside his apartment for him. She learned during that phone call with local police that earlier that day, Israel's employer had actually contacted police, concerned that he'd been missing work and that they couldn't get in touch with him. They'd called him repeatedly, leaving voicemails, and had received no response. He even had a paycheck he hadn't bothered to pick up, which was totally out of character.
Yeah, it's hitting all the red flags.
Definitely.
Good for the employer for calling them.
Yeah, it sounds like they really cared about their employees, and they were very proactive about trying to ensure their safety. At the request of Israel's employer, local police had performed a welfare check at his apartment. When they'd arrived, they'd noticed, just as Debbie would later that day, that Israel's vehicle was parked outside, unlocked. Not only that, but its keys had been left inside. A quick note on the keys being left inside the vehicle. I don't know whether they were still there several hours later when Debbie checked inside the vehicle. The reporting I was able to locate on this case didn't say. And another quick note. Although Debbie called the police on this day, the 14th, it wasn't until the 23rd that Israel was actually officially reported as a missing person, according to what I've read. So I wish I could give you more details on that, because obviously the family had contact with police, and yet the investigation didn't actually begin to the 23rd. That was when he was officially considered a missing person. But I don't have more details. I know both of those things from the reporting, and we can only try to extrapolate from there. In any case, when officers did that welfare check at his apartment on the 14th, they noticed that his apartment door had been left unlocked. In fact, they'd actually found it partially open.
Okay, that feels like something that would have been noticed on the 13th when they visited.
Well, on that subject, it's important to note that when Israel's mom, Debbie, and other family members had stopped by his apartment, each time they'd been there, the door had reportedly been shut.
I wonder if they ever tried to see if it was unlocked.
I wondered about that too, but that's one of the things I just don't know about this case, unfortunately. Now, on the 14th, officers had entered the apartment through that open door in search of Israel, but he hadn't been inside. It had looked to officers, though, strangely as if Israel could have just walked out. The lights inside the apartment were on, and so was the TV. A video game console appeared to recently have been played, with its controller laying on the floor. Wytheville Deputy Chief of Police Gary Davenport, who was a detective back in 2008 and assigned to Israel's case, would later tell journalist Jasmine Franks that, quote, It appeared as if someone had been sitting there or laying there and playing a game, end quote. Other than the controller laying in the middle of the floor, the apartment was neat and organized, just as Israel had always kept it. He was a clean and tidy person and had been since childhood, according to his family. There was no sign of a struggle inside his home. It looked almost as if he'd simply stepped outside and simply vanished. And he might as well have done exactly that, because he's still missing to this day, and answers have proven incredibly difficult to come by. At the time of this recording, Israel has been missing for about 17 years, and the investigation into his disappearance remains open. Deputy Chief Davenport summed up the strangeness of this case thusly when speaking to journalist Jasmine Franks, quote, Israel pretty much led a straightforward, regular, boring life, I guess you could say. He lived at home, seen his son on weekends he could see him, and worked a short time at Radio Shack. There was nothing you would consider strange or bizarre about his past that would cause him to just up and disappear, end quote. And yet, he had just up and disappeared. And as days, then weeks passed, investigators leaned heavily into the possibility that his disappearance had been the result of foul play. It was, it seemed, the only thing that could explain why he hadn't been in touch with his family, especially his son. No one who knew him could imagine him abandoning his son, and not long after he went missing, his son turned 8. Israel, of course, wasn't there for the party, and the idea that he might voluntarily miss it was absurd. He loved his son more than anything, and in his absence, his family members were faced with the heartbreaking task of trying to explain to his son why he wasn't present for his birthday. When it came to who might have wanted to harm Israel, explanations proved difficult for investigators to imagine. One angle investigators considered involved a woman who Israel had recently begun casually dating. I can't tell you much about her because her name has, understandably, never been publicly released. I only know that she lived in neighboring Pulaski County, that they hadn't been seeing each other for long, and that Israel was contemplating terminating the brief relationship. The reason for it was this. The woman lived with her mom and had just welcomed another person into their household. That person was a man who'd just been released from jail. This made Israel feel uneasy and as if the relationship just wasn't a good fit.
Understandable.
Yeah. Because of the very limited information that's been shared with the public regarding this aspect of the case, I can't tell you who that man was, what his criminal history was like, or the exact nature of his relationship with the woman Israel had been seeing. I only know that investigators did look into whether he and/or the woman might have been involved in Israel's disappearance. Investigators interviewed both of them and put them through polygraph examinations. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that neither of them seemed to have been involved in any way. Of course, we know that polygraph examinations are pseudoscientific at best, so those don't mean much. But polygraph examinations aside, investigators also interviewed them and didn't find anything indicating that the two had been involved. Unfortunately, there just wasn't a great deal in the way of other leads. A cashier at a local gas station reported that Israel had come into the store a few days after his disappearance. Supposedly, he'd been accompanied by another man. Whether or not the cashier really saw Israel, though, or just someone who happened to physically resemble him, is unknown. Many gas stations in Wytheville and the surrounding area receive a high volume of visitors, especially out-of-town and out-of-state visitors. This is because Wytheville is located along a major interstate, Interstate 81. In fact, Interstate 81 intersects with Interstate 77 in Wythe County, just a few miles outside of Wytheville town limits. The amount of traffic that passes through the county and right by the town is incredible. Many people, truckers and travelers of all types from all over the country, pull off of exits into Wytheville to fill up their cars or to grab coffee or a snack while traveling. So whether or not that cashier really saw Israel is anyone's guess. Nevertheless, investigators followed up on the tips they received, eager to explain what had happened to Israel. Some of the tips led them to seek out assistance from other agencies at the local, state, and even federal level. But even with the help of other agencies, including the FBI, answers eluded them. In a brief interview occurring about a month after Israel vanished, Wytheville Police Captain Rick Arnold expressed the department's frustration to journalist Nate Hubbard. He told him simply, "Nothing's turning up right now." To this day, nothing has turned up, leaving investigators to contemplate theories that so far have yet to be substantiated. More on those next. And now, back to Israel's story. When 28-year-old Israel Smith vanished from small-town Virginia, no traces of his destination or his reason for leaving were left behind. Investigators quickly discovered that he'd led a quiet, low-risk lifestyle and had been close with his family who lived locally. He'd been especially close to his young son, Isaiah, and the thought of him voluntarily abandoning him was unthinkable. All of this naturally led investigators to consider the possibility that his disappearance had been the result of foul play. They followed up on tips and leads they received, but none seemed to result in anything more than a dead end. According to Wytheville Police Deputy Chief Davenport, theories on the mystery of Israel's disappearance are nearly as numerous among officers as they are among citizens. As he told journalist Jasmine Franks, quote, "You could probably ask everyone in this department, do you have a theory? And everyone's got one." End quote. As for Deputy Chief Davenport himself, he believes, as virtually everyone seems to, that Israel is deceased. In that interview with Jasmine Franks, he explained, quote, "There's no doubt in my mind that he's dead and has been for many years. It's just bizarre. Someone knows something. He didn't just fall off the face of the earth, although it certainly appears that way." End quote. Deputy Chief Davenport has also expressed certainty that Israel would not have abandoned his family, particularly his then 7-year-old son, which means, of course, that his disappearance was likely the result of foul play. As for who was responsible and how it played out, well, like Deputy Chief Davenport said, someone knows, but so far that someone has not come forward. One possibility is that Israel may have been abducted from his home. That would explain things like the unlocked door and the TV and gaming station being left on, as if abandoned mid-game. Did someone knock on Israel's door and abduct him or lure him away when he answered? Maybe, but who and why?
So far, that's been my leading theory, but I mean, it just seems so bizarre because of his lifestyle that there's not really much opportunity there.
It does seem bizarre. One thing that stands out to me is this. It seems as if someone may have been in and out of his apartment after his disappearance. I mean, after all, when his family members went by his apartment in an attempt to check on him, the door had reportedly been shut. Debbie had even left sticky notes on it, asking Israel to call her. But when investigators had gone there on the 14th to perform a welfare check, the door had reportedly been partially open. So, who opened it? Was it someone who'd been involved in his disappearance? If so, why did they go back? Was it to clean or tidy up the apartment in some way? To look for something?
I'm almost wondering if it's not more of like a nosy neighbor trying to see why everybody's coming over and checking on him constantly.
That's possible too. If the door was unlocked, it could have been anybody.
But then they don't want to feel like they're a suspect, so they don't want to share it with anybody.
That's possible. I mean, you might look in at your neighbor's house if you thought something was wrong, but then you might not want to admit it because you don't want to look like you're super nosy or poking around where you shouldn't be or something. Yeah. I could see that.
You don't want to put yourself in the list of potential suspects.
Right. Reporting on this case mentions the house being tidy and never mentions anything being taken. And we know for sure that neither Israel's TV, video game console, or computer were taken. Those are all high-value, portable items that would likely be taken during a burglary, and they were still there when investigators took on the case. It seemed like nobody had ever touched them. So presumably, Israel was not robbed and his apartment was not burglarized. Why anyone would want to harm Israel, if not for material gain, is a mystery. It doesn't sound as if he had any enemies, and as we've mentioned, he led a low-risk lifestyle. Furthermore, the place where he was living was not exactly a hotbed of violent crime. While researching this case, I located a report on crime in the state of Virginia in the year 2007, so just the year before he disappeared, and it's published by the Virginia State Police. It broke down crime stats by locality, and I took a look at Wytheville's. If Israel was murdered, which seems like a real possibility, that was very unusual for Wytheville. In the year 2007, there were no murders at all in the town. Other violent crimes were relatively uncommon too. There was one reported abduction that occurred in Wytheville in 2007, 0 robberies, and only 7 aggravated assaults. And yes, the town's population was small, but even when translated to per capita crime rates via a quick calculation, those numbers are pretty low, statistically speaking.
I mean, it really is kind of surprising how little crime there is for somebody to just vanish.
It is. So this view into crime rates in the town around that time, it really makes the fact that Israel was likely the victim of a violent crime all the more strange. As you can see, that was not common in this town. In a town where violent crime rates were low, one does not expect a law-abiding person leading a low-key life to fall victim to violence, especially random violence. While researching, I also looked for any other similar crimes occurring in the area in the 2000s without luck. Israel's disappearance, it seems, was truly an outlier. Naturally, during the course of the investigation, investigators reviewed his cell phone and bank records. However, they yielded little to nothing in the way of clues. As journalist Jasmine Franks writing on this case points out, cell phones were less sophisticated back in 2008, and the information to be gained from them by investigators was much more limited.
I mean, technology has gone a lot further, and now you have full-on geofencing, but...
Right, just wasn't a thing back then.
You could only pretty much ping and triangulate, and that's if the phone was on.
Right, and, even if you found a location, it wasn't going to be exact. You could say, oh, maybe they were within so many miles of a tower, it was far from precise.
Yeah.
Investigators also collected Israel's computer and had it forensically examined, but that didn't yield any clues either. While researching this case, I looked at maps and photos of Israel's home. I couldn't help but notice how incredibly difficult it likely would have been for someone to forcibly abduct Israel from his home without anyone noticing. The building that was subdivided into 4 apartments, including his own, is small. It's basically the size of a single-family home, but divided up into 4 units. It's a single-story structure with 2 of the apartments on the main floor and 2 on a basement level. In order to see those, you've got to look at the sides or the back of the building, as they're not visible from the front because of the way the land slopes. In any case, assuming that the other 3 units were rented out at the time of Israel's disappearance, he had 3 sets of neighbors living in the same small building that he did. Plus, there are plenty of other houses near his. It's a residential neighborhood with homes sitting in close proximity to each other. And his small apartment building is located on a street corner at the intersection of 2 residential streets, making it visible to numerous other homes in the neighborhood.
It really does seem like if he was taken from the property, he went willingly.
It does seem that way. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, Israel's apartment was neat and tidy when investigators surveyed it. All of this indicates, like you said, Scott, that if someone took Israel from his home, he went quietly, likely willingly. This could indicate that he left his home with someone he knew and trusted. And it's certainly worth mentioning that the majority of murder victims are killed by someone they know. Stranger killings are more rare, statistically speaking. This is true in all places, let alone quiet, low-crime neighborhoods like the one Israel lived in. So, both the statistical odds and the circumstances are in alignment, suggesting that if Israel was a victim of foul play, the most likely suspect, or suspects, are not strangers. While we're on the subject of statistics, the vast majority of murderers are male. So, statistically speaking, if Israel was murdered, the most likely suspect is a male who Israel knew. It's also worth mentioning that we don't actually know for sure whether Israel made it home to his apartment on the night of his disappearance. The last person confirmed to have seen him was his brother, who he visited that night. What happened to Israel after that, where he went or didn't, is technically a mystery. It's possible that he never returned home at all. To the best of my knowledge, no one actually saw him at home on the night of the 10th or any other time since then. Now, of course, his vehicle was parked outside of his home as if he had returned home that night. And maybe he did. But what if he didn't? What if something happened to him before he could make it home that night and someone else parked his vehicle there?
Yeah, I was going to say, so far, most of our theories run off the assumption that he was home, and that is based off of his vehicle being there. But it doesn't sound like there was really any useful forensics taken from the vehicle because he wasn't reported missing for so long. And by that point, multiple people had checked inside his vehicle, so it would have contaminated the findings anyways.
Right. To be honest with you, I don't know whether investigators ever collected or attempted to collect forensic evidence from inside the vehicle. I couldn't find any reporting that said. But in any case, if Israel fell victim to foul play at the hands of someone he knew, They likely would have known where he lived and could, hypothetically, have parked his vehicle there, perhaps late at night, to avoid being seen, to make it appear as if he had made it home. For that matter, even a stranger likely could have looked at Israel's driver's license or vehicle registration to determine his address and could, hypothetically, have returned the vehicle to his residence. And anyone with his vehicle keys likely would have had a house key as well, which could potentially account for why his apartment door was eventually found to be unlocked.
I mean, the only thing I have to say that would be weird would be making it look like he was playing a video game.
Right. Hypothetically, that could be staged, but it would be unusual. It's possible, but it would be kind of weird. Now, all of this, the idea of Israel never making it home and getting into some kind of trouble along the way, that's all just one possibility. It is also very possible that Israel did make it home on the night of his disappearance.
Either way, it's one of those cases that's so lacking in information and motivation and suspects that you kind of do have to look at all of the possibilities.
Definitely. And I can't help but wonder whether anyone Israel knew left town shortly after his disappearance, since leaving town shortly after the commission of a murder is common behavior in killers. However, I don't have access to that information. Were I investigating this case, though, that's certainly something I'd look into. And perhaps investigators have looked into that. It wouldn't surprise me at all. Speaking of investigators, law enforcement officials weren't the only ones to look into Israel's case. According to Jasmine Frank's reporting, Israel's grandparents hired a private investigator. However, to the best of my knowledge, the private investigator didn't have any more luck than police. And speaking of police, they haven't forgotten Israel's case. In 2023, Wytheville Deputy Chief Davenport told journalist Jasmine Franks, quote, "I sift through it once in a while just to see if there's something I missed. You just never know, something might hit you different. But all it's ever done is confirm or reconfirm everything I've ever tried, and it's not taken me anywhere." End quote. When it comes to Israel's disappearance, the greatest tragedy is that his son, who he loved so much, was left to grow up without a dad. Today, his son is an adult, just a few years younger than Israel was at the time of his disappearance. And if Israel were alive at the time of this recording, he'd be 45 years old. As it stands, he disappeared and likely died at the age of just 28. Over the years, there have been several times when human remains have been found in Southwest Virginia, but each time they've turned out to belong to someone else. Where Israel's remains might be is unknown. Southwest Virginia is mountainous, largely rural, and mostly wooded. The possibilities are vast. What exactly happened to Israel remains a mystery, the most significant mystery Wytheville police have ever faced. At the time of this recording, 17 years have passed, and after so long and with no body, the most likely key to the solving of this case is a tip from the public, someone who knows something. If you know anything about the disappearance of Israel Smith, please call the Wytheville Police Department at 276-223-3300. And if you found this case to be of special interest, you may want to check out our episode on the unsolved disappearance of Eric Smith. His case is not related to Israel's, and the shared surname is merely a coincidence, but he also disappeared from Southwest Virginia, seemingly without a trace. We aired our episode on Eric's disappearance in July of 2022. You can scroll back to then in our feed to listen if you'd like.
That's all for this episode of Last Seen Alive. Thanks for listening. Make sure you check out our website, lastseenalivepodcast.com, for photos from the story and links to sources we used to write it. While you're at it, follow us on Insta at LSA Podcast and TikTok at Last Seen Alive Podcast. Episodes of Last Seen Alive air every Monday. See you then. And if you think bringing unsolved cases like Israel's to the public's attention is important, please take a moment to rate or review Last Seen Alive and tell your friends to check us out too. We'd really appreciate it. And don't forget to check out our merch store where you can get an LSA t-shirt or hoodie. We donate 50% of the proceeds from every sale to the DNA Doe Project. Last Seen Alive is a Studio 222 production. Research and writing for this episode is provided by you, Leah. Audio engineering and editing is provided by me, Scott.